It's another normal night walking your part of the street, servicing the normal Johns, and keeping an eye out for the occasional undercover cop. One of the other working girls walks up and tells you this guy is asking for you directly, pointing at this older gentleman with a wide mustache leaning against this ugly brown and white Toyota RV. Even though you feel uneasy about the look of the guy, you approach and ask if he's looking for a little company tonight. Unfortunately for you, your gut instinct was right, and he tells you he's an undercover cop and that you're under arrest. Heavily rusted cuffs are placed on your wrists, the man dragging you into the RV while your heart races and adrenaline pumps through your veins. You feel a prick on your arm and immediately start seeing the world around you blur, now so lightheaded you can't stand up on your own. You feel your body being lifted off of the ground, and the last thing you see is the door to the RV opening and the inside of the truck before everything goes black. When you start to come to after God knows how long, you discover that you can't move your limbs. You can't see anything or scream for help, being both blindfolded and gagged. You hear the click from a tape recorder, followed by the horrifyingly familiar voice of the man that kidnapped you.
Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances.
Your heartbeat is thumping in your ears.
For a little while at least, you'll need to get your shit together and listen to this tape. It's very relevant to your situation.
You struggle against your bonds, desperate to get away from what you can only describe as a living nightmare.
I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you, and how long you'll be here.
Every possible vile thing this man can do to you flashes through your mind, the realization that you might not make it out alive setting in. You listen against your will to over an hour of pre-recorded, nightmarish details of the sick things that are going to be happening to you. You're told how to conduct yourself while you're captive of this inhumane man, told of questions you'll be asked in this depraved questionnaire he says you'll be taking. And it all ends with this.
Well, I believe I've told you about everything that I can. I cannot predict the future. I cannot predict changes of procedure. But if this tape is being played for you, I have to assume that it's still reasonably accurate. And I can only give you advice. Be smart and be a survivor. Don't ever scream. Don't talk without permission. Be very quiet. Be docile and obedient. And by all means, show proper respect. Hey, have a nice day.
Now I know what you're thinking. This has to be made up. There's no way this could actually happen. Unfortunately, the events described are very, very real. Calling the man in question a monster would be an understatement. I don't believe any particular word could describe the horrors he exacted upon the unfortunate women who met this man. In this video, we open the case file for one David Parker Ray. Or rather, we open up his toy box. David Parker Ray was born as the first child of a turbulent family on November 6, 1939, in a very small town out in the desert called Belen, New Mexico. His father, Cecil Ray, was a violent alcoholic that grew up in the backwoods 20 miles outside of Mountain Air in Socorro County during the Great Depression and lived in the shadow of his much more successful and charismatic brother, Alton. Cecil would leave home in the mid-1930s and settle in Belen, where he would eventually marry a local girl, David's mother, named Nettie Opal Parker. Because he was less successful in life, Cecil ended up moving in with Nettie's parents on their ranch, where both David and his younger sister Peggy were born. His violent tendencies and propensity to drink heavily escalated over the first 10 years of David's life, ultimately resulting in a bitter divorce. He moved to Albuquerque, and Nettie chose to stay with their parents, sending the two kids to live with their grandparents in Mountain Air. Their grandfather, known as Old Man Parker at the time, was a very strict, old-fashioned man who had a firm grip on his household and everyone who lived therein. The 60-year-old man's standards for how the kids dressed and acted in private and public were extremely high, to the point where they wouldn't even think of defying him. Peggy would later attest that she and David wouldn't, quote, even think about lying about things. The Rays were devout Christians that would regularly beat the children if they did not live up to their expectations. Old Man Parker would make the children work on the family farm in the morning before they were sent to school, but their grandmother, though they were poor, made sure that the kids would be clean and neat in hand-me-down clothing every day. These strict standards would ultimately cause the unusually tall and timid 12-year-old David to become the target of school bullies when he started attending Mountainair High as a 7th grader. He was ridiculed for being fair-haired, for rarely ever talking, and for having the top button of his shirts buttoned while the other children left it unbuttoned. It also didn't help that whenever a girl talked to him, he would become even more introverted and turned a bright shade of red. This bullying later led to the closest friendship he had during his 6 years living with his grandparents, Audie Miranda. Miranda intervened in another bout of teasing where the typical bullies were pulling at David's hair, the two boys eventually getting into a fight with said bullies until the bus driver could break it up. They would initially spend time between classes playing catch and would later spend weekends together at the Ray Ranch. Both were naturally adventurous and of the outdoorsy ilk, riding horses, playing cowboys and Indians, having extended games of hide and seek in the desert, and looking for fossils and stones while they were out on their adventures. The next year, David would receive a Cushman pacemaker motor scooter, igniting his love of and natural gift as a mechanic. The new hobby of taking apart and putting things back together instilled a boost of confidence in the boy that was not seen previously. Though you wouldn't think he had a sinister bone in his body, an obsession that would later manifest as the very reason he became infamous was taking root. One large reason for this was one of the two parents that had effectively abandoned him. Cecil made infrequent visits during the 6 years David spent living with his grandparents, passing down sadomasochistic pictures and magazines to the impressionable boy. Nettie wasn't any better, visiting as infrequently as her ex-husband and making no maternal connection with either of her own children. The lewd material caused David to start fantasizing about using bondage on women as he tortured them, a fantasy he told Peggy was just a new hobby when it was found. This hobby was his way of gaining control of something in his life, since his grandparents and his natural shyness kept him confined for the most part. He, like many other serial killers, dreamed of taking out his fear and hostility on some poor woman, growing to depend on those fantasies to feel like he had control over his life and over the world around him. David was an outcast, a below-average student with mostly D's in all of his classes that disliked sports due to his lack of athleticism, with an appearance that couldn't come off as anything but odd. He hung around other white children, if he hung out with anyone at all, and chose not to associate with anyone of any other race in a predominantly white and Mexican school. The only achievement David ever had was playing the trumpet in the school band. When their grandmother passed in the summer of 1957, David dropped out of high school and moved to live with his mother in Albuquerque, while Peggy decided to stay in Mountainair with a local family until she graduated from high school. Once David moved, all connections to anyone he considered a friend were severed. David graduated from Valley High School in northwest Albuquerque before moving out and becoming a handyman mechanic for work. During this time, he started dating a teenage girl and entered his first marriage in April 1959 to a woman who would later give birth to his first child the following year, David Elvin. Just months after the marriage, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and was sent overseas as a general mechanic that honed his skills working on everything from wristwatches to airplane engines. His first marriage fell apart the year after David Elvin was born due to extended assignments overseas, eventually resulting in the 21-year-old returning to the States on emergency leave to file for divorce. The divorce was finalized without any resistance, and David was awarded custody of his son, who would later go into the guardianship of Nettie and her new husband. He would marry a second time in 1962 to a woman he met while on leave, whom he separated from just 3 months later and would divorce 2 years later. After 3 years of service, David was discharged from the Army and took a job as a driver for his stepfather's truck driving business in Albuquerque while living in their home. He got married for a third time to 18-year-old Glenda Burdine after a whirlwind relationship, adopting her son Ron and having a second child with her, Glenda Jean. Like he did with the son, David abandoned his family to hitchhike as a hippie and picked up a teenage blonde girl named Sally to be his dutiful girlfriend. He picked up a new job as a mechanic through an interaction with the owner of a truck stop off of Route 66, the owner later stating that he was charmed by the mechanical knowledge Ray had. The truck stop owner and his girlfriend became very close to David and Sally, the owner admitting later that Sally looked up to him as a mentor while David charmed everyone with his skills as a mechanic. The two couples would confide in each other at a very personal level and party every night after closing shop, everything seeming like the perfect life over the summer. And then Sally, who was pregnant at the time, disappeared with all of her things in the middle of the night, David stating that she was a free spirit and had left on a whim. David left in the fall, went back to his family to live the complete opposite lifestyle as a family man, taking a job repairing cars and returning to school to get his aircraft mechanic certificate. He moved the family to Tulsa, Oklahoma for a teaching job at Spartan School of Aeronautics, a prestigious trade school that was known for instructing pilots from the U.S. Army Air Force and England's Royal Air Force during World War II. He taught engine mechanics and specialized aviation mechanics for 2 years, raising his children in a gentle manner opposite the life he lived with his grandparents. He grew extremely close to Glenda Jean, whom he adored for her unapologetic independent streak. From the outside looking in, the life David lived during this time would be considered picture perfect, but behind the scenes he struggled with the obsession that started back in his teenage years. He became more fixated on his sadomasochistic fetishes, where he would go from completely normal to absolutely needing the fantasies of violent, depraved sex in order to find sexual release. David later admitted his fantasies controlled him to the point that he could only climax when thinking about killing women. The Ray family moved again to Victoria, Texas in the mid-1970s, where he was a volunteer fireman and gas station manager until 1977 when he returned with his family to Albuquerque. His third marriage to Glenda soured just like his first when his new job repairing railroad tracks for Atkinson, Topeka, and Santa Fe railroads had him moving constantly for the next 5 years. Glenda decided to stay in Albuquerque with the kids in 1981, David only visiting Glenda Jean, who now went as Jessie, when he was in New Mexico. David finally settled in Phoenix, Arizona in 1981 after taking his mother's maiden name and beginning work as both service manager and lead mechanic for Canal Motors on North 35th Avenue. He spent 8 years working there to build up the thriving business and married a fourth time to a woman named Joni Lee, whom he took out a lease for a property in state-owned 513 Bass Road near the Reservoir Lake at Elephant Butte, and a second property at Stone Lake, New Mexico between Grands and Gallup. He used these properties as a secret getaway to explore his dark desires in the S&M world, bringing women he met there for sexual bondage sessions. David moved into a double-wide trailer directly after leasing his lot in Elephant Butte, where he would design and create specialized bondage equipment that was sold through his post office box. The secrecy was obviously a perk of living in Elephant Butte, but another reason he enjoyed this property was because it was close enough to the Mexican border that he could kidnap girls and torture them before selling them to human trafficking rings across the border, according to Jessie. Speaking of Jessie and her accusation of international sex trafficking, I think it's about time we take a quick look at her past. Jessie was the epitome of the phrase, "the apple doesn't fall far from the tree," a tomboy from an early age who loved outdoor activities and inherited David's talent with mechanical engineering. She absolutely adored her father, spending as much time as she could with him learning how to take apart and rebuild car engines, taking long walks, and hunting at Elephant Butte State Park to the point where she was an expert shot with a collection of hunting rifles. Her adoration remained unshaken when David exposed her to his sexual deviancy, making no effort to keep his lifestyle secret like he did with everyone else from her. Jessie became extremely confused with her sexuality and eventually came out as a lesbian in her late teens with a serious addiction to weed. There was one incident in Phoenix that she vividly recalled during her interviews with the FBI where her father got too violent with a paid prostitute that was brought back to the Ray home to the point where the woman ran naked from the residence. The accusation of sex trafficking I referred to beforehand came in June 1986 when she filed a complaint with the New Mexico branch office of the FBI. The subsequent, thorough investigation turned into a dead end and the case was closed, effectively ending Jessie's only attempt to get away from her father. David fell under suspicion of foul play for the first time on September 22, 1988, when his boss at Canal Motors, Billy Ray Bowers, disappeared off the face of the earth. The initial investigation into Bowers' disappearance led to the uncovering of evidence that he was deathly afraid of his business partner. His family and friends attested that he had expressed his fear of his partner on multiple occasions, made a secret copy of the company books, and left instructions in said books for the police if something ever happened to him. An investigation with a $5,000 reward was initiated and David was questioned, but nothing ever panned out. That is, until a body covered in a blue tarp was found floating in Elephant Butte Lake. The body was weighted down by 2 boat anchors tied by rope to it, a single gunshot wound to the head being the cause of death. The body matched the description of Bowers, but the time of death couldn't be identified due to changes in water temperature, and the identity wasn't confirmed until the case was reopened a decade later. The FBI eventually dropped all investigations into David, who was their prime suspect due to a lack of evidence, and effectively kicked the already depraved man's fantasies into overdrive. Before I get into the details of this torture chamber that David Parker Ray created, I want you to understand that if you are not of strong stomach and could possibly be triggered by anything that I talk about now, I would highly suggest that you click off of this video immediately. His confidence and resolve went through the roof, deciding to create the ultimate torture chamber that was even more extensive than any in history. David fantasized about using this facility to study non-consenting women at close quarters with an array of torture devices, documenting his findings thoroughly and, as a sexual scientist, execute everything with clinical precision. He started to create detailed instructions on how to best torture his victims physically and psychologically, how to take and hide souvenirs of each victim to relive their torture, and how to use the footage he had taken to sell as snuff movies to other enthusiasts all over the world. Some of these films would later be speculated to contain the documented murder of women during bondage sessions. He also purchased a 22-foot-long white cargo trailer he would park right next to his double-wide, his toy box, with a hand-painted sign inside its entrance reading Satan's Den. He spent countless hours and tens of thousands of dollars upgrading this cave of horrors, starting with soundproofing the trailer from top to bottom, along with installing a deadbolt lock with reinforced steel frames. He equipped the trailer with air conditioning and video cameras, a TV monitor set up so they could watch what was happening in real time. The walls were lined with S&M paraphernalia, along with medical cabinets containing syringes, adult toys of every size, various chemicals, electric cattle prods, and various other torture devices. If you think that's bad, it's about to get a lot worse. A 7-foot-long coffin with restraint hooks and ventilation holes was also installed in the trailer, along with a completely remote-controlled gynecological chair that had stirrups and could freely move about on a 6-foot track. He began perfecting how he carried out the kidnapping of unwilling women and bringing them back to the toy box to be thoroughly violated in unimaginable ways, purposefully choosing those who were unlikely to be missed or reported missing, such as druggies, prostitutes, or transients, and picking them right off the street at knife point. Once back at his property, he would blindfold his victim and play version 1 of the tape referenced earlier. He went into gross detail about how he would train these women to be sex slaves, bragged about how long he'd been carrying out these horrific acts, told them that they would be given drugs such as phenobarbital and sodium pentothal, and assured them that they never be found while he remained free. David finally became so obsessed with this process, with the high he got from it, that he had quit his job at Canal Motors and permanently moved to Elephant Butte, starting his own towing business called Dave's Automotive Repairs and serving as the only emergency auto repairman in the area. Once again, we're going to switch gears and turn our attention back to the other main character in our story, Jessie Ray. While all of this was going on, Jessie Ray went through an exceedingly difficult time in 1990 when she gave birth to a baby late in the year fathered by a friend of hers, Kayla Elise. Though this is usually a joyous occasion for most women, she had to deal with the unending rumors that her own father was the one who impregnated her. She and her alleged wife, Terry Haffenbrack, spent the next few years raising the little girl in a small Albuquerque apartment, Jessie taking on multiple jobs to provide for them. Visiting her father often, she began to frequent Elephant Butte Lake and fell in love with playing pool at local bars to the point she was considered a legend. Unfortunately, her relationship with Terry fell apart and the police were called twice for domestic violence starting in November 1992, both instances resulting in the couple making up and all charges being dropped. David continued to carry on his dark activities without question from anyone else in town, the town being filled with anarchy running the streets and local law enforcement losing horribly in their battle to counter it. Alcoholics, drug addicts, and societal misfits ruled the city, and because of that, secrecy was key to survival. What wasn't kept secret, however, was David's propensity to hold wild parties and rumors that he would be hired by rich men to attend and run live sadomasochistic sex performances that would be taped for later distribution. On July 23, 1993, David recorded the infamous tape quoted at the beginning of this video, elaborating even more about his disgusting desires and processes. David's fourth marriage ended in early 1994, and Joni Lee was removed off of all leases they previously bought together, allowing him to reinvent himself once more and abandon his towing company. He took a short-lived job as a welder and mechanic for the Sierra Valley Construction Company, and then another brief job in Tucson, Arizona, working at the headquarters of Sunt Construction Incorporated. The final job he settled on was as a vehicle mechanic for Region 4 and Elephant Butte State Park, gaining the Parker Ranger uniform he later used to trap victims in a Parks Department truck with installed CB radio. He excelled at his job to the point he won multiple awards, completely fooling everyone around him as he became even more familiar with the desert terrain he is believed to have dumped multiple bodies in. All the while, a jealous David accelerated the demise of Jessie's relationship with Terry. Jessie had gotten used to her father's proclivity to gruesome torture and allegedly murder, leaving him alone when he had company over to satisfy his needs. Every time she would leave to go back to Albuquerque, David would become ill to the point she would return to take care of him, even if it took a severe toll on her own health. She would become so ill from stomach ulcers that she would be airlifted to Albuquerque for medical treatment. With the 50-year-old David suffering from angina and irregular heartbeat, Jessie finally ended her relationship with Terry in August 1995 and moved in with her father. This drastic change would be a catalyst for some of the most infamous acts of depravity in New Mexico history and the beginning of a more than deadly partnership. Because the story is as long as it is, and with all the information that I found, I'm going to be splitting this into two parts, with the other coming out as soon as I possibly can get it to you all. I don't want to miss anything, and I want to make sure that everybody that sees this video, or these videos, understands every bit of how gruesome this particular case actually is.